I'll tell you something else. I think you need real character progression that you can keep using to evolve your characters long after you're max level and long after you have the best gear in the game. What do you think? Yes.
Masteries were one of two key systems in Heart of Thorns that sought to address the question of end-game progression in an RPG that will never raise its maximum level. So one of the questions has often come up: what do you do at the end of the game after level 80? In other MMOs, this is an easy answer. Wait for an expansion, the maximum level's now higher, go grind them up, work for new gear, get more powerful, then do it all again. Not in Guild Wars. Instead, Heart of Thorns tried giving us masteries. In theory, you can still progress your character, but it's horizontal progression. Instead of getting stronger, you're now unlocking new capabilities that new environments will require of you. Traversing the expansion's jungle will take learning how to bounce on mushrooms, understanding the native people's languages, and gliding over huge chasms and gaps that would otherwise be untraversable, among other things. What's nice about this is it doesn't invalidate old content and gear while still giving you something new to work towards. Then, with the next expansion, there can be a whole new set of challenges and associated abilities to learn. It's a solid concept that in many ways I can bluntly confirm, in some respects, did work out. Exploring the jungle before you have all of these new tools at your disposal is a much harsher and different experience to when you have them. However, that said, I am not a fan of how the mastery system turned out. Let's first talk about how to get masteries. How this works is you can complete specific content or achievements to gain mastery points, which you then spend to buy new abilities that are then in turn trained with experience. So there are two components to discuss here: getting the mastery points and grinding out the XP. I think the question of how much experience do we need takes the majority focus for most newcomers. It's a thing we're all sensitive to from other MMOs that want us to grind a lot. I think how much players struggle with this is very much dependent on their class, luck, and understanding of the game. I, for example, felt gaining the experience required was a breeze. I deliberately used no experience boosters or other advantages available in the game for the first 80% of all my time gaining masteries to try and have a grounded perspective for the system, and I felt they had it balanced at a reasonably healthy level. One consideration I think most new players forget is this: the mastery system is account bound. You will do it once ever, it will affect all your characters, and you will never do it again. So with this in mind, I expected them to take much longer than they actually did in the end, and it was a pleasant surprise. Now, don't let me pull the wool over your eyes. Many people at release did not feel this way and complained about Guild Wars 2 introducing mandatory grind to experience the story. But I view this not as a problem with the amount of experience required, but something else. ArenaNet made the mistake of making some story steps require certain masteries to be completed before you could access them. This meant most players were hitting an arbitrary mastery wall, and it didn't feel good. In truth, I think what ArenaNet were doing was very smart. What this does is it forces the player base out of the mentality that the only story worth playing is in the main instances and nowhere else. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with asking people to play the rest of the game for experience. By adding that mastery gate, the developers aren't saying, hey, grind and spend gems because we're evil corporate douchebags. They're saying, hey, go play the meta events and explore these maps. Those stories count too. Experience all of it. However, despite being a good idea from this one perspective, it just wasn't solid design. One key component that made the mastery system genuinely fun was in deciding what masteries to go for first. These gates muscled that idea to the side. Would you like to learn the ways of the Itzel, the Nuhawk, or the Exalted next? What about becoming a Master Glider? Well, tough luck. You don't get to decide because the story dictates you need to get the Exalted Mastery next. Beyond that, some of these mastery gates were very lazily implemented. There's a particularly bad moment towards the end where players were asked for a certain high level of Nuhawk training because... Why again? Because you say so? If instead of using these binary on-off switches to dictate whether players can pass, the developers had intelligently designed the missions to be based around the masteries, so they steadily got harder and harder without the right one unlocked until there's an eventual gate, I think the system would have been much stronger. A moment ago, I mentioned I had an easy time getting experience and was not particularly a part of the community backlash. This is, I feel, because, as I also explained, there were many factors at play. Your experience with the game, your class and luck. These will affect how frustrating getting experience is. See, as an established player and an elementalist, not even using boosters, I had an understanding of things like getting bonus XP for killing rare mobs, how to tag the most enemies during events, or how to tag as many events themselves. And all of this will have over time made things easier for me. There's also a component of luck and time zones in that you just might not be around when a lot of other people are to do the hard-hitting events. Maybe the mega server system was screwing you out of opportunities. I can definitely see, combined with the increased difficulty of the enemies in the jungle, a lot of new players or even returning rusty players being slowed down a lot by this stuff. So that's experience. I really don't have much more to say, except that I never personally saw the issue at all, and perhaps this discussion is now unwarranted. Several months after the release of Heart of Thorns in the big Expansion 2.0 patch, ArenaNet listened to the players and straight up doubled the XP yields from jungle enemies, making things remarkably easier. Let's talk about Mastery points. There are both good and bad things in the Mastery point system. At first, I didn't like it at all. This is because I often found that I was so flush with points, I never had to pay them any attention, a failed concept entirely to me, so readily handed to the player that the currency may as well not exist at all, save for the few rare occasions where I actually did look at it. But my playstyle is very completionist. I would always do a range of content and try to dip my feet in everything on each map before moving on. I'd actually look at what achievements were available and see if I could possibly get some, even on the first time through. That meant I got a lot of points naturally. That's not necessarily the experience of a regular player who isn't as interested in the franchise as I am. I also already had a lot of Corteria stuff done before Heart of Thorns even came out, so I never had any trouble with buying masteries associated with the base game, which are different to the ones in the expansion areas, and we'll discuss later. Despite this first impression that the points are very easy to get, I have found over the past year that if someone is stuck unable to finish the mastery system, more often than not it has nothing to do with experience, but it's the points that they're short on. I'm not really sure why this is. Maybe for some people it's that they try to go too fast and play a narrow window of content, feeling some desire to catch up when they join an MMO, which, as I've explained, isn't really relevant to Guild Wars 2. The newest maps added, for example, are always designed to not require super high mastery progress, so there's really no reason to rush. Despite this fact, the question of how do I get my masteries as fast as possible seems to be everywhere. These people get blindsided and won't find the adventures, or give them more than one half-assed attempt, or explore as much as they perhaps could, ending up short on points. Though that's just my theory, and the reality may not be so extreme. Whatever the case, on your first time through you can spend a damn long time on those maps, and I always suggest that people do, otherwise they'll be missing loads of points. The way Guild Wars designs its open world content, a lot of it's very easy to miss, and the core game never did a good job getting people to slow down in my opinion. So I quite like that the mastery system is encouraging people to relax a bit and actually pick this stuff up. When I say it takes time, I mean that in a good way, by the way, not a grindy one, it's just playing the game. There weren't many maps added after all, so it's kind of important that the ones which were get explored properly, and the mastery points do just that. As for Corteria, here the points are much harder to come by. I do think new accounts will take a long while to get those, especially without owning Living World Season 2 separately, which gives a good share of them. Despite being in the privileged position of having been an active player when LWS2 released, so I didn't have to pay for it, I must say I don't really object to ArenaNet adding more incentive for people to buy that stuff. Though some do. Whatever your stance, without Living World Season 2, you will have to scrounge a bit for core mastery points. I think this could be because they didn't want to give mastery points to players who aren't even level 80 yet, as they aren't relevant at that point, and that eliminates most of the Corteria content, so the points tend to be in the harder places. Maybe the game could be a bit more forgiving in this regard, but the Corteria masteries feel incredibly phoned in, so I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. We'll get to that in a sec. The last thing to say about the mastery points would be how they're displayed above your character. Remember, this system is here as an answer to end game progression and not having to increase Guild Wars 2's maximum level. Before Heart of Thorns, pretty much everyone was level 80, and so seeing the little 80 next to people's name became meaningless user interface bloat. To address this, since Heart of Thorns, we now see a player's mastery level displayed instead, as it presumably has more meaning. Before launch, this was something I was really excited by. The thought that we'd see our friends in game world and wonder each time how much deeper into the progression they'd gotten excited me, and particularly the idea that it might be capless. The results hasn't really been all that glamorous, but it is somewhere on those lines. The most dedicated players only took a handful of days to hit max, and the other normal players were maxed out within 2 or 3 months of release. It took me even longer than this still, as I went a significant duration of time, completely uninterested in picking up the core Tyria points, but there was nothing prestigious or hard about that when I did. I really don't think it's worked out in the same way as, say, another MMO, when a level cap is raised and there is a race between players to see who hits max first. Maybe this can be true with future expansions, but I didn't sense it much from Heart of Thorns, and this may in part be because we were never particularly clear what max was when we were working for it. Because the system is account-bound, that number is really just a way to judge how long or how recently someone's been playing the game. So, for example, if they have barely any points, you can guess they only just started playing, and you treat it in the same way as, say, achievement points. If they have max points, like you probably do, it just means they've played the most recent patches. If they have slightly under max, it means they haven't logged in for a month or two since a few more masteries were added. That's about it. ArenaNet do indeed continue adding further masteries with Living World Season 3 and raid updates, which has added another layer of quality to them when compared to Living World Season 1 or 2. I see this as a positive thing, as long as they don't run out of inspiration or lack the resources to make genuinely interesting ones. The thermal propulsion, allowing you to fire yourself through volcanic vents in Ember Bay, and ancient magics, allowing you to fight spectral agony, have both been interesting additions to the Living World, but nothing as fundamentally game-altering as gliding was. The raid masteries, on the other hand, I feel were a little underutilized and irrelevant, because acquiring them doesn't have anything to do with the raid, really. Again, I mentioned a moment ago that most of the fun from the mastery system is being able to choose what you want to go for first and making interesting decisions in terms of order. Even though the new patches have been adding new masteries, it's slow and one at a time, so that feeling has never been recaptured and is unlikely to until a full expansion release in the future. Your average interaction with masteries as an active player is pretty limp. Just click to train the new one when the patch comes out and that's it. More often, you're annoyed that you forgot to activate it than you're having a fun experience. They'll never make updates to existing masteries either, it seems, because they've set the precedent that later mastery stages will cost dramatically more experience, and as such haven't left much space for themselves to change the initial ones that came with the release. I've already mentioned how underwhelming the raiding masteries have felt, but really I think this is just a symptom of a far bigger problem inherent to the mastery system's current implementation, and this is how global it is. With Heart of Thorns, ArenaNet appreciated that different masteries would have to be paired off with different areas of the world, introducing the idea of core Tyria masteries for non-jungle stuff, and Maguma jungle masteries for jungle stuff. But neither was this taken far enough, nor was it done with consistency. On the matter of consistency, there are a couple of illogical things happening. For example, why does core Tyria legendary crafting affect Heart of Thorns legendaries? And what will happen to this when future expansions release? Will this one line just bloat to ridiculous levels? Also, since the update enabling gliding through core Tyria, why is this still considered a Heart of Thorns mastery? Again, if we can glide in core Tyria and have jump pads in core Tyria, why no updrafts or anything else that affects that line? Next, why are counter magics from Living World affecting core Tyria bosses? Not that this last one is a particularly bad thing, or any of them really, but the system struggles to live in its own boundaries. Then come the far more important issues. The raiding masteries feel wonky maybe because, rather than being a new capability rewarded to players who have spent a long time in the Forsaken Thicket, so you experience those encounters without the benefit of those masteries at some point, they're instead just a weird barrier you end up going off into regular Heart of Thorns maps to grind a bit in first, which is a total slap in the face to ArenaNet's philosophy of skill, not grind, being the determining factor, as well as missing the point. Granted, it's not that hard to do, but it feels like an odd outlier, and it will be especially prominent for new players in subsequent years who will not just have to do one small mastery, but a whole tree before maybe being allowed to raid. It doesn't feel like masteries do much in raids, except add an extra mechanic here or there that could have been added anyway without being masteries. I think it's the mastery system's inability to be precise that causes problems like this. Take for example the fact that the newly added region, the Fire Island chain, is still quite oddly hosting Maguma jungle mastery points, and not a new type more appropriate for that region? Are they scared to add a new category for Ember Bay because the region will be so small? What about future expansions then that are going to add more than one region at once? Is that just never going to happen? Maybe the answer is to categorize Masteries under expansion titles rather than regions, but it's still not the whole solution. The worst offender to me is what happened with the Bloodstone Fen update. Here the developers introduced a bunch of new glider abilities for us to earn and then use. Sounds like a perfect candidate for the Mastery system, no? Perhaps an extension to the pre-existing gliding Mastery tree or a whole new one? Well, no. Because the system can't affect only that one map, but instead whole regions at a time, and the developers didn't want us to have those abilities in the other jungle maps because they were ridiculously overpowered, they had to bypass the Mastery system altogether with this. They threw an NPC in the game on an airship who takes specific Living World Season 3 map currency, earned in Bloodstone Fen, and you have all the abilities unlocked that way. What's so disappointing about this is not only that the Mastery system is clearly unfit for purpose and failing in its ambition, but that it sheds light on the fact that Masteries can be accomplished with something as simple as a single NPC who sells new skills. Masteries were maybe nothing special anyway, just a neat package and PR spin on simply executed concepts that would have came nonetheless. So far, you may have gathered I'm not particularly impressed with many aspects of the Mastery system, but where it really falls down is with the Masteries themselves. Even considering other logistical issues, ArenaNet still did have an opportunity to present something really flavorful and involved if they handled this right, and most never lived up to my expectations. To begin, I will acknowledge that a collection of Masteries really did add a lot to the game in mechanical terms. The entire gliding tree, from all the basics of first flight to updrafts and ley lines, I would say was expertly implemented. Bouncing, speed and adrenal mushrooms too. I found all solid inclusions to the game that we still see littered around new Living World maps to this day and were fun to unlock. In particular, I enjoyed at release before everyone had everything maxed out, It's All Poison and running Zergs into a deathly haze to see who would survive. There are some notable duds, definitely, such as Exalted Support or New Hawk Alchemy, which really deserve to be touched up, but they are not the overwhelming majority. That said, neither gliding nor any other good mastery, for all their mechanical strengths, are what they could have been. Gliding, for example, ArenaNet could have wrapped around real content and meaning behind manufacturing a glider for yourself and tuning it as you go. Gliding was fun in the end, but I never really felt like I'd built a glider or refined a glider or been on any semblance of a journey of progression with it. Remnants of these ideas can still be seen by those rare few who mouse over the Masteries user interface, which weakly attempts to give this detail, but this goes ignored by most and is not enough. It doesn't feel like real content because sadly the Mastery system is only existent on the UI, and this is where it loses points for me. Without question, the most underwhelming were the language-based Masteries. Pre-launch, we were told we could visit the jungle and slowly, through the Mastery system, come to know its denizens. At first, they would be almost hostile aliens speaking a strange language, but with experience, communications would open up, and eventually secret techniques would be ours for the taking. But what we got instead was the most basic and boilerplate implementation possible. A handful of NPCs who speak perfect English already, but at first won't sell their wares to you and later will. Plus access to a daily chest. You're probably going to ignore after finishing a couple of collections if doing it ever. This sucks! This isn't learning to communicate with magic fantasy people, it's filling an XP bar and getting a merchant. And what sucks more is that there is space for the game to have taken these ideas further. I could levy a fairly substantive critique like this at most Masteries in Guild Wars 2, but to save time, let's just settle by saying this. While a handful may have had strong and fun mechanics, most Masteries could have had a lot more flavour and been far more divergent from one another at that. While many Heart of Thorns Masteries felt lackluster, I would still say they are several times better than what was developed for Core Tyria, a measly 3 lines and not one of them particularly interesting. It is curious to me how many players farmed experience for these particular Masteries in one of the dungeons at release, considering how little they add to the game. This was not nerfed at the time, as the developers were not interested in playing a game of whack-a-mole, where another easy experience farm would inevitably pop up in its place after every futile attempt to stop the community cheesing the system. They suggested that if people wanted to use the strategy, so be it. It just wasn't worth the effort, and I think this was a reasonable stance to take. XP gain in general for core Tyria seems to have been considered very offhandedly. The truth, when it comes to core Tyria masteries, outside of the points, is this. They might be kinda slow to get until you do fractals. Then you'll have them maxed out so fast your head will spin, whether you were trying to get masteries or not. That's about it. There isn't much to the system. Looking at the core Tyria masteries themselves and how thin on the ground they are, I really think the developers were either completely out of time or inspiration, maybe both, and should probably not have implemented them. So let's see, we've got the Fractal Mastery Tree. Of all of them, this is probably the best one with the most going on. It's so much that if you quizzed 100 active veteran players of Guild Wars 2 to detail every aspect of what the Fractal Mastery Tree gives you, I'd be surprised if you got even 5 people who knew it all off the top of their head. Fractals were a horrendously bloated and complicated system for a good chunk of the year. The masteries interacting with them only compounded the issue. Offering mostly irrelevant perks and basic gates like access to NPCs, for some people it felt more like a way to force core Tyria and free-to-play accounts to buy the expansion, despite the fact that they were playing content established before Heart of Thorns came out. After the updates to Fractals, making them far more simple and therefore far better, the masteries still aren't that interesting, but their value is clearer, like unlocking new dailies and rewards and vendors. Nonetheless, rather than there being any cohesive sense behind the Fractal masteries, it's more of a scattershot approach. The benefits of these masteries are just walls of text, filled with a bunch of random different stuff. Some is goodish, some is not. It's the throw a load of stuff at the wall and see what sticks approach. Next, we have the Mastery Tree that was set to tie in the new legendary crafting systems. At first, it sounded like a great fit, allowing players to put that experience they get while farming for so much gold to good use at the same time. But, thanks to the fact you probably already have this done, especially if playing Fractals, and it doesn't reset with each legendary you craft, that's irrelevant. The legendary crafting mastery is also utterly flavourless. It's literally just getting a mail and unlocking vendor wares, nothing more. As far as I see it, the only true benefit to this mastery being in the game is that it directs new players who have recently hit level 80 to the idea of crafting a legendary, and thanks to the much more piecemeal acquisition process of the new scavenger hunts, they are gently fed into endgame systems and continue playing, but that's about as forgiving as I can be. Last to discuss would be the Pact Commander line. This was discussed and implemented right before Heart of Thorns came out, probably to fill out the core Tyria masteries a little better, even if there wasn't much inspiration for what the hell to do with it, and it shows. I don't actually dislike a lot of what was added to the game with this. Even if a little weird, mentoring has been useful to some people. The Pact Supply Network merchants are a fun enough system. Reviving players faster is a useful perk. And even if I have personal hang-ups about it, I can see why many players love the auto-loot option at the end of the chain. That said, I think it's clear that none of these things needed to be a mastery. It's like they scrambled together a bunch of things that were coming with Heart of Thorns anyway, tied them under a very loose theme, threw in some ridiculously minor perks like 10% higher crafting experience, and called it there just to pad things out. Hardly impressive. The devs did suggest before Heart of Thorns that they wanted auto-loot as a mastery so that fresh bot accounts can't access it easily, which is understandable, but still not enough justification to cobble together such an odd mastery tree and sell it as content and not just a feature update, which is what it really was. I think if you're going to make core Tyria masteries, the developers need to actually update core Tyria content to have space for it, or to leave it alone. As we come to the end of this video, I'd like to discuss one final thing. My last point of discussion on masteries is on a stance of mine that maybe not many people share, but I feel very strongly about. And that is that account-bound masteries were a mistake. Over the course of this video, we've managed to get a lot of discussion out of this system and its many weaknesses, but to be honest, at this point, it's not stuff many active players really care about. And why? Because the mastery system is something we hardly interact with. It was something that was there a year ago at the launch of Heart of Thorns, we did, and now is totally irrelevant except for the brief time a new one's been introduced with a raid or a living world update. Nobody cares because it came and went. Wasn't this supposed to be a defining feature of endgame progression for Guild Wars 2? ArenaNet's decision to make the system account-bound, a single, one-time per human experience, at first looks like a noble and cool one. It's to stop people who love alts having to grind, right? Well, sure, But I honestly feel like designing it from the ground up this way was dooming it and a big mistake. There are costs to this decision. Remember earlier when I said that one of the most fun things about the mastery system was having a bunch at once and getting to decide what order you do things in? Well, for a year now, none of that exists in Guild Wars 2. And it won't exist again until some untold time, years down the line, when we have another expansion and it returns, but only for a small flash in the pan. Remember earlier when I mentioned a fun moment being running a Zerg into a room filled with deadly haze and having no idea how many of my allies had trained with the Nuhawk yet? Perhaps a bit trolly, but a memorable experience that can never happen again. Remember earlier when I said there was a little bit of UI text with flavorful descriptions on how we built our glider, but that it is almost useless now because no one ever looks there? That's because once you've made a grand total of 6 clicks on the panel, you'll never ever look back. What irks me about this account binding is the graveyard of content and experiences it leaves behind. My first time stepping foot into the expansion was a magical, awesome experience. Unable to glide or bounce on mushrooms, I found myself treading paths and watching parts of the environment I never do anymore. Then I had several great moments when I learned these abilities. The moment I first unlocked leyline gliding and traveled to a hidden area, the Burnisher Quarry in Auric Basin, was one of my all-time favorite moments of the entire expansion that categorically cannot happen again. And it's more explicit than this too. What about the countless mastery point communes littered around the maps? In truth, I find the communes to be quite lame. They're not very distinct at all from hero challenges and are a very basic thing. Go to an area and press F. Except this time you don't even get a bit of flavor lore. But that aside, those communes do now represent positions in all manner of locations around the Heart of Thorns maps, some of them quite involved and difficult to get to. I have only ever been once and will never have the incentive to return to. Let's say I take a break for 2 years. Maybe I'm waiting for the new expansion, then I want to come back to the game and experience Heart of Thorns properly again. No, you're not allowed, because everything is forced to be unlocked on you. It's genuine content that ArenaNet enforced a shitty shelf life on. You might remain unconvinced and repeat yourself. No, I don't want to have to grind them over and over again. But what you're doing there is you're taking the default stance that they have to be uninteresting and that they have grind, which is wrong. Masteries were about embracing Metroidvania. They were to show there is some positivity in that experience of finding an obstacle that you can come back to later. This is what adventure games thrive on, and that doesn't change just because we're in an MMO. You're never asked to just skip to the end of having all your upgrades and capabilities at the start of a Zelda game, because you know half of the fun is acquiring that stuff. Masteries could have been, should have been that too. The developers should have made a fun system and then not been scared to have their audience interface with it. What I'm absolutely convinced happened instead is that by making the poor decision to account bind masteries, the developers realized that the system didn't even have to be that good. People would only do it once after all, so it gets away with not living up to its potential, and all the stuff mentioned today is left to fester. Making it account bound is dooming it from the start, establishing from the get-go that this is a sucky system people will only ever want to skip, rather than creating and embracing the value masteries should always have had. I would love to see the mastery system adapt in the future. I would love to see real thought and effort put into its trees, the experience required to climb reined in so that things don't get too slow, and the whole thing made character bound instead. The beginning of this video established one thing we're all in understanding of, that masteries are as a substitute to raising the level cap. They are Guild Wars 2's endgame progression. Continuing that comparison, making this system account bound, is like raising the level cap, then after you hit the new max on a single character, every other toon lifetime on the account will be bumped to max 2. In some places, I absolutely see the value in account binding, but that this system, something that is such a blatantly poor fit for it, was treated the same way, is ludicrous to me. And those are my thoughts on Masteries. It's such a marginalized and small part of the game now, especially when compared with its brother feature, Elite Specializations, which we'll talk about next. I honestly find the pre-release talk about it laughable.
Guild Wars 2's endgame character progression. Well, now you understand why we had to go build this expansion pack. This is what Heart of Thorns is all about. Deeper challenge and deeper progression.
At their core, they are still a strong concept and can shine in future expansions. But for now, this is one of the places Heart of Thorns scores its lowest marks for me. Thanks for watching, let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time.